In this lecture, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at what we call religious colonies, and understand that we're not necessarily going to cover how every colony was created. We look for patterns, we look for themes. So we're going to use 3 colonies that religion shaped their founding in some way or form to kind of understand the importance that it had in establishing what became the United States. And we've already seen how different religious ideas formed back in Europe because of the Protestant Reformation, and we got ideas like predestination and the creation of the Anglican Church. First example we're going to take a look at is what becomes known as Plymouth. So when we take a look at Plymouth, what we're going to be initially doing is focusing on the Wampanoag. And in southern New England, where Plymouth was established, the Algonquin-speaking Wampanoag were the most prominent, tribe, nation of Native Americans. And Owasmaquin, or Massasoit as he sometimes is called, was the leader of the Poconokeets, who were a part of this nation. Now the English, when they met him, kind of believed him to be a sort of king, but the reality is that nobody really held a truly royal position in North America because alliances were not sworn like in Europe. Back in Europe, you have to bend the knee, bow to a king, you pledge your loyalty. That's not really how it worked in North America. These alliances were more fluid, and leaders had to consistently prove that they deserved to be followed. It wasn't something that was a given. Now, the Wampanoag had been dealing with European traders for about 2 decades, and even though they did begin an exchange for European goods, not all of these interactions ended positively. So that's why when the Mayflower, which is the ship that these settlers came on, first arrived, they were hesitant and they really kept their distance. Now, as to the English settlers of Plymouth, the core settlers believed that the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England, was too corrupt to be changed and too corrupt to be reformed. So they fled to a place called Holland, which is across the English Channel, technically, southeast of Great Britain. And Holland is a bit more tolerant, and these people were called separatists because they fled England instead of working within the system and staying on the British Isles. Their location in Holland was way more religiously tolerant than where they were, and they could practice their religion relatively safely, but as time went on, their children became more Dutch. They adopted more elements of Dutch culture, became more comfortable with the Dutch language, and there wasn't necessarily as much work available for them in Holland, so they ended up striking a deal with the Virginia Company to go west and settle in Virginia, and this is the same company that established Jamestown. The initial voyage consisted of about 35 individuals who made the journey for religious reasons, and they become known as the Pilgrims, or sometimes the Saints. And about 65 other individuals made this initial voyage, and they went for other reasons, and sometimes they were referred to as strangers. There were supposed to be 2 ships that went, but one sprung a leak, so everyone just kind of crammed on board the Mayflower. And their ship was actually supposed to land at the mouth of the Hudson River, kind of near what's today New York, but they ended up south of their intended destination, and their charter didn't necessarily give them the authority to go ashore. Now, going aboard could have been viewed as defiance to the king, and there's a lot of legal issues at play here. And there was really nothing else to bind these people together. You have the so-called saints, the more religious folk, and the strangers, which is everyone else. There's nothing to make them work together. So the adult men on board the ship drew up and signed what was called the Mayflower Compact, a covenant in which they pledged to maintain their allegiance to the king and maintain order by just setting up a government kind of similar to what they left behind. Now, when they went ashore, they actually settled in a land where the land had previously been cleared. It had been occupied, but the original inhabitants had all died due to a previous disease epidemic. And the homes that were present were actually a bit more seasonal. So the English kind of kind of waltzed in and thought, hey, there's homes here, this is great, not necessarily realizing they belong to somebody else. Now, the first winter was a real struggle to survive, but the following March, which was 1621, an indigenous man actually began walking towards Plymouth, which was a walled-off settlement at this point. Now, the English, to arms, they prepared to fight, grabbed their guns, but then this individual, named Samoset, said in perfect English, "Welcome, Englishmen," welcoming them to this land. And he himself had learned the language from English traders and fishermen in his homeland a bit north in modern-day Maine. And this led to more cordial relations with the Wampanoag, who did ultimately assist the settlers and allow them to survive in this colony. So it was definitely touch and go, and it's not going to be easy going for the next couple of decades, but Plymouth does survive, and religion had a large role in settling this colony. Now, the second religious colony we're going to look at is MA, or Massachusetts Bay. And you look at any textbook, you're going to see this guy's picture. John Winthrop. Now, Massachusetts Bay Colony was set up by Puritans, but they made it very clear that they were not separatists. They are not like those people in Plymouth. They're not looking to leave the Church of England, necessarily. Now, Winthrop does serve as governor for a large majority of his adult life, but he actually had to be convinced to invest in this colony. He wasn't necessarily part of the inception of it. Now, Winthrop is very religious, and he was convinced that his participation in this colony would allow him to set up a place that was more godly than the one in England. That's kind of the phrase that he uses. They want to purify the church of corrupt elements, hence Puritan. They don't necessarily want to separate from the church entirely. Now, to this end, he delivered a speech on board his ship that was going to be bound for what we now call New England. Officially, the speech is called A Model of Christian Charity, but it becomes nicknamed the City Upon a Hill speech, because he envisioned this new settlement to be a more godly settlement, a city upon a hill that could serve as an example for all to see. Now, in his time, the speech kind of wasn't noticed all that much, but it has since gone down as an important speech in American history. So he really believes they can be a shining beacon of light for the rest of the world to follow. And the voyages led by Winthrop are going to set off what becomes known as the Great Migration of Puritans to what they called the New World. And there were about 45,000 that made their way west. About 20,000 of them are going to end up in New England. Now, the large-scale migration actually ended. There's just a set period of time that it occurs. It ended because of events back in England. The king had been executed, and Oliver Cromwell was named Lord Protector of a Commonwealth. And there's a whole ton of backstory to this, but it matters to us because now, in England, Puritans would be more free to practice their faith. All right, so there was a set period of time where lots of Puritans went west, but then this migration kind of stagnates for a time. Now, Massachusetts and other Puritan colonies that came later kind of preferred to settle in towns because it would provide safety from potential native attacks, and it would be easier to support schools and churches. Now, there were others that spread out in search of more farmland and hence more settlements. For example, we have Salem, which is going to be famous for a series of witch trials, actually did exist when Winthrop was looking for suitable land, but it pretty much was made up of shacks, and it just wasn't much to look at, so it didn't inspire much confidence. So they ended up going up the Mystic River and founding what's now the city of Boston. And as to Puritan society, they believed that their way of life and worship was the best. And just anyone who vocally disagreed, they got rid of them. And those who disagreed with their established religious practices, and anyone who disagrees with an established religious practice, is known as a heretic. Now, the banishment and sometimes voluntary expulsion of residents is going to lead to more settlements in New England. Now, keep in mind, each of these towns has its own congregation, and each congregation made their own choices. So there's plenty of places to go if maybe where you're living, you're not so keen on their ideas. And contrary to common belief, the Puritans weren't always stuffy and, not game for fun. They did like to have fun and have a good time. They just simply believed it should be in moderation, and their intolerant nature has kind of led to this belief that, they were kind of a no-fun zone. And actually, this intolerance, to a degree, will lead to our final religious colony, Rhode Island, although it's not necessarily religion in the way we might think. Now, Roger Williams, the man you see in the statue, was part of the initial wave of English migrants to Massachusetts in the early 1630s. This guy's unbelievably bright, very intelligent, but he has an independent streak that gets him into a little bit of trouble from time to time. He turned down an offer to be the preacher at a church in Boston, and then he leaves for Salem, where he did become a minister. Now, he left Salem for Plymouth, went back to Salem. You get the idea. This guy's kind of going back and forth to different towns, so he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And he was actually supposed to be banished and sent back to England because he condemned the king for giving away Native American land. He was very radical in his belief that land belonged to the indigenous occupants, and so if it was going to be occupied by Europeans, then these people should be fairly compensated. That didn't go over so well. He also condemned the Puritan faith for remaining within the Anglican Church, which he just thought was too corrupt. So his banishment was actually voluntary. It was more or less, we're not going to make you leave, but you should leave. So to escape his banishment, he went south and lived along the Narragansett. And he would advocate for the Narragansett people for a good portion of the rest of his life. And some of his followers even followed him, and he founded the city of Providence. Now, simply put, in this place, different religious ideas were tolerated as opposed to being pushed out. And he also insisted that all Christian faiths would be accepted in his settlement. So this laid the groundwork for what we now refer to as the separation of church and state. So when we look at Rhode Island, Roger Williams stands out, as Anne Hutchinson. So Hutchinson is just highly intelligent, very similar in the vein of Williams, but she causes a stir when she led religious meetings from her home that would discuss biblical passages from the week's sermon. Very common Puritan practice, but she also openly questioned the authority of several ministers. A little bit of a no-no. She also tried to explain that to be saved and go to heaven, all you needed was personal faith, as opposed to basing everything on your actions on earth. And she even kind of went as far as to infer that maybe you don't even need to follow the 10 Commandments to get into heaven. Now, men had engaged in such actions, but they were treated differently. Hutchinson was outright told that what she was doing was okay, but she needed to stop because she was offending the men of the colony. And she was even publicly rebuked by John Winthrop himself, and Winthrop was not a fan of Mrs. Hutchinson. She was placed on trial and was banished, taking refuge in the new town of Portsmouth. Now, in 1644, Portsmouth and Providence fused together with two other towns that were actually founded by banished Puritans, and they received a royal charter as Rhode Island. Unfortunately, Hutchinson did not live to see this. She and her family had gone to New Netherlands before this, and they had been killed by Native Americans in where they first settled. But no denying that Hutchinson is in the vein of Roger Williams, kind of a rebel who wasn't afraid to speak her mind. And this is something that really stands out for Rhode Island. There, you can see on the map that you have Connecticut to the west, Massachusetts to the east. Rhode Island was despised, especially by Massachusetts and Connecticut. Absolutely despised. But it was also an outlet for those who wanted to flee the strict faiths of these two places. As much as these colonies didn't like Rhode Island, they understood its importance, because if they wanted to banish somebody, there was at least a place for them to go so they could no longer, cause problems in Connecticut and Massachusetts. So again, there are other places, but Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and Rhode Island stand out as three prime examples of colonies where religion formed a large reason for their founding.